Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So my name is, my name is Michelle Domain. I am a class of 2022, so very recently minted lawyer. And I am one of the co-organizers for the Black Law Alumni Reunion Weekend. And I just want to add my voice to the chorus of warm greetings and salutations that I'm sure you've received since stepping back on campus. So we're glad to have you all here, happy to see you all. And my task really is just to introduce our moderator and our panelists for this morning. And then I also want to remind everyone that immediately following the conclusion of this panel, we are hosting a Market Friday, which is going to be held in the West Courtyard, just outside of the law school, as well as in Monroe Quad. So please be sure to stop by, pick up some great items. There are foodstuffs, there are teas, natural botanical teas, natural kind of energy drinks that are available, as well as some very colorful and vibrantly colored home decor, apparel, lots of things out there. It's kind of slipping my mind at the moment, but please go out there and enjoy that as well. So without further ado, we have Jared Davis, who is going to be our moderator for this morning's panel. And we also have Ms. Lori Dubriel, we have Ms. Aste Davis, and we have Dr. Kenneth Aurier as well from the School of Public Health. So I'm going to turn it over to Jared, and thank you all again, and please enjoy the panel.
Good morning. Now, Michelle, before you race out that door, it is very important for me to make sure that I thank Michelle for the work that he has done, as well as Clara Smith, who couldn't be here today. He kept me organized, kept this panel together, and made sure that we had a robust and comprehensive group to talk to you guys today. So I did not want you to race out without me saying thank you for doing it. Let me echo the remarks that have already been made earlier today in terms of welcoming everyone back. I am pleased to be in today from Houston, back in New Orleans, back on campus, back at Wyman Hall. Now, I don't know how happy I am to be in room 110. I remember a C- or 2 resulted from this room. In general, I am happy to be here, and I am happy to be with this esteemed group of people here today. One of the things we tried to do, or we did do in putting this panel together, was to give you a broad perspective across this topic, representing academia, industry, nonprofit, as well as government. And I want to thank the Dean Jupiter, for allowing us to open this reunion weekend with this topic, a topic that is not routinely discussed in the legal profession as much as some of the other topics that are equally important. But I'm very glad to talk a bit about environmental law and environmental justice for today. We, in terms of kind of logistics for the time together today, we have some questions, some thoughts, some perspectives that we would like to share with you for today. We'll do that for a period of time. And then we know that Dr. Aurier will have to leave us a little bit early due to a commitment. So we'll make sure to get you out on time for that. And then we will continue the dialogue with you and hopefully have some questions and comments from you in the audience as well. So that's just a little bit about the logistics for today. We hope this will be a spirited and good discussion among all of us here as family members on this particular topic. One of the things that I wanted to do to go to each of the panelists to open this up is really giving some perspective on their career path, as well as what brought them to this area of environmental law. And I'll kick off myself with talking about something that my colleagues and classmates here on the first row, class of 2005, will tell you. Always here representing on the front row. Look, you know, when we talk about what all of us are a result of our perspectives, our backgrounds, the places where we come from. And one of the things that I talk about routinely is growing up in Mobile, Alabama, son of a geologist and a community pharmacist. And I mention that specifically because it is at the root of this whole concept around people, planet, and profit, these tenets of sustainable development. My mother, as a geologist, gave us, as the kids, this perspective around protection of the planet, this concept of Earth, planetary limits. And it was very unique having a mother with that kind of profession to anchor us in the scientific principles around that. The balance of that with a father who was a community, what I call old school pharmacist, who had a pharmacy in a neighborhood where he supported what we would call today a social enterprise, actually. Because my father felt like he needed to turn a profit, but he also understood that the people in the community that he supported, some of them, he was their lifeline, because you can't go to CVS or Walgreens and get medication on credit. My dad would allow people to pay for medicine with pound cake, collard greens, and other things that was the best that they could offer. And I did not realize until 25 years later that that is what was at the root of what gave me this baseline around people, planet, and profit. So what I did as a career path, however, was I decided to figure out, how do I do that inside the gates of a corporation? How do I ensure that that company stays within those planetary limits? That while we do need to turn a profit, I do work for a for-profit entity, that we are doing that within a way that makes sense, that is good for profit, that's good for the communities that we operate in, and that are good for sustainable development. And so my last 23 years at Dow Chemical has been really around regulatory compliance, sustainability. I've worked in product regulatory, I've worked in operations regulatory, I've worked overseas in Africa. I've had a chance to do a number of different things, and I'm in our global public policy organization now, and I lead our global policy efforts around social equity and human rights. And this shows the commitment that our company has to getting this right and to having a dialogue and understanding a bit more about what it is that we need to do as an entity. And so that is what brought me to environmental law. That is what allowed me to build on the base I had at LSU in a scientific background in environmental science, and then ultimately coming back to Tulane to get a JD with a specialty in environmental law. And you'll see this illuminated and elucidated in some of the conversations that we'll have in the next hour. But that's a bit about me, a bit about what brought me to this debate. And I will turn to my colleagues to introduce themselves, the perspectives that they offer, and let you learn a little bit more about their career paths, as well as what brought them to environmental law. And I'm very excited to turn it over to my friend, Lori, who has a very similar background to me in terms of LSU and Tulane. So Lori, I will turn it over to you.
Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. So my name is Lori Dubrell, and I currently work with the U.S. Department of Justice in the Environment and Natural Resources Division. So first, I have to give the disclaimer. These are all my personal views today. I do not represent the views of the United States government or the Department of Justice, but my personal views for working in this space. And what brought me to working in the environmental space, and I will say my career path has been kind of a combination of focused decisions as well as a little bit of dumb luck along the way. And I first got interested in environmental issues because my senior year in high school, I took an ecology course, and we went to our local landfill and it was closing. And it's like, well, what's going to happen to our trash? What happens next? It's like, this is interesting. I might like it. You know, my mother was a linguist, college linguist, spoke 4 languages. My dad's a mathematician. Like both of those options, but I decided I'll start off at LSU in environmental science. And I came to Louisiana because I wanted to find someone who looked like my dad for a husband. How I got here. My family is originally from here. And then I thought, well, maybe I'll switch to math or foreign languages. Didn't go the foreign language route because of the thick Southern accent. The math, took my first calculus course. Too many letters, not enough numbers, but I stuck with the environmental path because it was problem solving, it was finding solutions, and the intellectual curiosity of this space is what really interested me. And so when I was in my senior year, it's like, okay, what am I going to do next? You know, once you go through your courses or whatever, it's like, I'm not a lab rat. I like the outdoors, but I'm not really an outdoorsy person. What am I going to do next? Talk to someone at a party, and they said, you know what, you should really think about environmental law. It's like, oh, okay. And I thought about it, it's like, yeah, I think that could be very interesting. It's like, but I need more science as well, because I don't think I know enough science to really be in this field. And so I started researching the schools that had, the universities that had joint degree programs. I got in the School of Public Health and the environmental law program at Tulane and did the joint degree. And that was one of the best decisions I made, just kind of on a whim. Because when it came time to look for a job, it's like, I think I really want to work in government because it's problem solving, finding the balance between industry and private sector. And the year I applied to work in Washington, DC at EPA's Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance, it was at the end of the Clinton administration going into the George W. Bush administration. They advertised 3 openings. They had over 2,000 people apply. What got me in the door was that joint degree, because they wanted the 2-for-1. It's never really 2-for-1, but they wanted the 2-for-1, and that's what got me in the door. And so I have worked, yesterday was my 20-year anniversary with the feds. I've done 11 years at EPA, started off in civil enforcement and did a little bit of international law related to airline drinking water quality. And then went into criminal enforcement, where I did that work out of the regional office in New York City, and did that for about 5 years. And actually had in a case where it was an environmental justice case. And then I had gotten burned out at EPA, because life lessons for students: don't let yourselves be taken advantage of, because they will work you to death if you let them. I got burned out, and it's like, I need to do something else. And so not everyone goes to the Department of Justice for life-work balance, but I did. And I'm with the Environment and Natural Resources Division, but I'm in the law and policy section. And so the areas that I concentrated on are criminal law, because of the criminal law background at EPA. I said I was interested in international work. But they also had me working on national response issues, emergency planning, because of some other work I did at EPA. And then the person who worked on the illegal logging and associated trade portfolio, he was planning to retire. And he said, you have an interest in environmental issues, in international issues? Yes. And at the time, the hot thing was wildlife trafficking. And so they offered me trees. And I'm thinking, trees? Okay, I'll do it, because, you know, you never know what it'll lead to. And I will say forestry has been one of the most exciting things I have worked on in my career. And so my career has focused on the pollution side, setting up the Environmental Crime Victim Assistance Program, which has direct overlap with environmental justice issues. And then I also work on natural resource trafficking issues, like illegal logging, wildlife trafficking, illegal mining. I don't do the fishing as much, but I do a lot of international capacity development with prosecutors and law enforcement. And I will say I'm very excited about this panel. I don't think we discuss it enough, because when I talk to other people of color about environmental issues, it's usually when I'm doing work in Africa, Latin America, or Asia. You see very few of us in this space in the United States, which is really tragic. And there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of good work there. And it's not what people think of when you hear environmental issues, like I'm going camping, granola issues. It's way more complex, way more interesting, and way more satisfying work, whether you're in government, nonprofits, or industry. I'll stop there.
Good morning, everyone. I am Aste Davis. I am the network manager of the National Black Environmental Justice Network. And I say it slow because I know it's a lot, and you'll hear me say NBEJN really quickly, but it took me a long time to say it that fast. I, unlike the other panelists, am not a science nerd. I don't have a science background, but I am a country girl, and it took me a while to own it, but that's who I am. I grew up riding horses, fishing, deer hunting, all the works. My dad had 3 sons in his previous marriage, and he got 2 girls this time, and I think he thought we were boys too, because that's what those were our family activities. But I say that to say that is why I have this love for the environment as well. I grew up in a small town in Baton Rouge, Louisiana called Alson, Louisiana. And I did not think anything was abnormal about my neighborhood. I grew up actually having field trips to our local landfill because they were convincing us that they were doing great things for our environment. Going to field days sponsored by Exxon Chemical because they were doing great things for our neighborhood. They were sponsoring field days. So what, I mean, so it wasn't until I started, traveling beyond my neighborhood and realizing, oh, on this side of town, there's no plants. Oh, on Wednesdays at noon, you don't hear a siren saying this is a test. And if this was a real drill, you would need to go inside and close your windows. That was my norm on a, Wednesday at noon. So once I started to learn more about why these things were harmful and think more about who is protecting people like me and my family. My great-grandfather, purchased this land out of saving from sharecropping. He, paid his way out of sharecropping and purchased this land here. And I think about my grandmother and her siblings and who is protecting them? Do they know that it's abnormal? Do they realize, that when there is a real drill, that there is actually a problem, that this is actually harmful to them? And so in undergrad, I went the psychology route, but I realized I was much more passionate about this because I had 3 internships in environmentalism and no psychology internships. So when I got to the end of my path, I was like, okay, now what am I going to do? And so I also am not a Tulane alum. I hope you guys don't kick me out. I'm from across the street at Loyola, but I did the environmental law certification there as well. And from there, I've done community philanthropy in a climate justice portfolio at Foundation for Louisiana, where I think me figuring out how to understand the verbiage, the terminology has helped me to do things like the program that I was running called Lead the Coast, where we were breaking down those scientific terms for neighborhood residents. And Chris is smiling because he was helping me out with some of that. And so I think that's been my superpower in doing this sort of work. Right now, I'm working with predominantly Black organizations doing environmental justice work, helping them to build capacity and build a coalition where we can band together to help influence policies, as well as, bring attention to issues in smaller communities that may not get the mainstream attention. So I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you, Dr. Ori.
Thank you. My name is Kenneth Ori, originally from Nigeria, Africa. I was a village boy, and I would go to the woods, construct small playhouse in the woods, hunt animals, fish, and enjoy the serenity of the woods growing up. And so that gave me the connection with the environment. And as a matter of fact, from time to time, when I will be given some domestic chores, I will escape and go to the woods. And then that we have to find me was going to be to go to the woods where I would be interacting with the animals. I would make my own local traps to hunt some rodents. And then I would make my own local slingshot. You call it slingshot here. The British call it catapult, to shoot some birds. So that's how my interest in the environment started. And then, of course, Nigeria, we have our legal system is an offshoot of the British legal tradition, the common law, which of course we have here, except for Louisiana, which is civil law tradition. But at the time that I had my basic legal training in Nigeria, there was no offering for environmental law. And so after my basic legal training in Nigeria, I went to Canada for graduate school in law. And that was where I realized that there were such things as environmental law courses and things like that. So I took quite a number of environmental law courses. And then following my master's degree in law from the University of British Columbia, I went to McGill University for my doctorate degree in law. And I did my doctoral dissertation in environmental law, comparing water quality legal regime between Canada and the United States. And then following my completion of my doctoral work there, I went to Kenya and taught in one of their universities. They are called Moi University in the northwestern part of Kenya. Northwest of Nairobi, the capital. It's called a place called Eldoret. And there I was given the task of being the chair of their environmental law division. And I headed that division for about 2 years, teaching environmental law and development. And then I left Kenya, returned to Canada, Vancouver, and practiced law there for a while. And then my wife got a job in the University of Washington, Seattle. And then I moved with her to Seattle, but she was a visiting professor at the time. And then when her visitation in Seattle ended, she got a job at Tulane here in the Department of Anthropology. And I had to move with her. And then, but when I got here, I realized that this was a relatively different legal system because Louisiana is civil law tradition. And so I had to put in my dossier, and through their credentialing unit, and they looked at my credentials and they said, okay, you go do our bar exam. So I went and did Louisiana bar exam. And since 2001, I've been practicing law in Louisiana. And then, but before then, I got an appointment with the School of Public Health in the year 2000. I started as an adjunct in the Department of Environmental Health Sciences, but they had a number of policy and management courses that they thought that I could bring some value to students. So I started doing that. And then, of course, I trained as a nurse too. I'm a registered nurse. And that was purely because of personal experience that made me to want to get some training in the medical area. Because from time to time, as a matter of fact, not too many years, I think a few years ago, I was having a deposition and my client caught seizure just in the middle of deposition. And so everybody started scouting around, you don't have medical skill of any kind. Of course, you have to call 911. But until 911 EMT shows up, what do you do at the moment? So my nursing skill helped me out. And from time to time when I visit, I've been away from Africa for about 35 years, but I do visit from time to time. And when I do visit, go into the villages, countryside, you see the difficulties. There are people dying of commonly preventable illnesses and things that you don't need a lot of health infrastructure to actually solve. Okay, so there are big things you can solve with big health infrastructure, but there are simple things that just basic health knowledge can help you solve those simple health issues that otherwise could become fatal for people. And
Well-
so that has helped me.
No, and
That's
look,
where I'm coming from.
oh, and I think, sorry to cut you off, but I think that that's very important. You've heard from all four of us where we come from a lot of different perspectives, anchored in some of the, you see a common theme across some of the areas that we're talking about. But what we want to do now is let's dig in a little bit deeper. We've talked about environmental law, what brought us to this space. But now let's talk a little bit specifically about environmental justice. And I have one question I want to make sure we get out for you before you need to exit. But let me just frame this question that we can come back to after Dr. Aurier departs. Around what is this concept of environmental justice? For those of you who are practicing in other areas in the audience, maybe heard about it, kind of get it. What is it? I will go to my colleagues here to give some perspective on that, and then we will quickly go to Dr. Aurier, because I think getting your perspective, Dr. Aurier, on the role of science will help to anchor the rest of our discussion after you depart. Look, from my standpoint, when I try to talk inside the corporate gates about this in terms of the simplest way to define what this is, it is the marriage of environmental protection and social justice. Drop the protection, put them together. That's really what we are talking about. How do we balance this concept of equity and environment, protection of the planet and social justice? But I say, maybe I'll turn to you and then to Lori on like, how do you define it? When you're going into the communities or when you're trying to express the work that you are doing to audiences that may not understand what this is, how do you simply define what is EJ?
So the National Black Environmental Justice Network is centered at the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. And I don't know if you guys have ever heard of Dr. Beverly Wright, but she's a legend. And one of the things that she is, very clear about is race and class. So when we talk about what things you deserve in this country, in the world as a citizen, you deserve clean air, clean water, clean food, and a place to, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? And so their environmental injustice is when people of color or who are in low income areas are not receiving those basic human needs.
So I will give you the federal definition that I work with, which is environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So it's a nice government statement. But in practice, when I work on cases, and my whole career has been in enforcement, so I see individuals and companies at their worst. I don't approach it in terms of environmental justice. I look at who was harmed, what is their appropriate punishment, and how can we remediate their harm. And so it doesn't matter to me what your socioeconomic status is, your racial status, etc., because it's about addressing that harm that happens specifically to you within the confines of the law that I'm able to do it. And so I treat everyone fairly. And that's the way I approach it. I know that's not the way everyone approaches it, but that's the way I have always approached it, whether domestically or looking at it internationally. And I would say in terms of like the social construct aspect of it, it's like understanding the community that has been affected and what would be meaningful to them. Because what I think might be restorative is not going to be the same thing for them on a daily basis. So you really have to understand the communities that you're working with and have that empathy. And so having that awareness is really important, I think, from a government perspective, because at the end of the day, when you're enforcing the law, you're looking to get justice. And you're looking to, especially in criminal context, address the victims that have been hurt.
So, Dr. Aurier, before you have to depart, maybe can you anchor us quickly on the role of science? Because at the root of a lot of the debate and the discourse around this topic is, what does the science say? So I want to know, is it conclusive? Is the science clear? And if not, why?
Well, the role of science is basically to provide data for policy making. because you don't want to make policy without being informed by data, because at the end of the day, you want to solve a problem. And so the best way to solve that problem is to understand what the problem is. That way you can create a policy that is measured to solve that problem. So science provides data, understands what the problem is, and provide data for policymakers to make policies that will be very responsive to that problem. So, but there's different lenses, I would say different scientific lens, depending on who the scientists are. So for example, the toxicologists will look for the causality between pollution in the environment and the physiological changes elicited from how people react to that, those who are exposed react to that. So the toxicologist will look at the carcinogen or the carcinogenic chemicals, the level of exposure, the frequency of exposure, the duration of exposure, and then what they call dose response. And then for the non-carcinogen, they have what they call the NOEL, no observable adverse effect level. And those are basically the way they approach this thing. And for the vulnerable communities, minority communities, or communities of people of color, or low social economic status, but people of low social economic status, the literature so far, for the most part, has not definitively made a causal connection between pollution, especially in the ambient air, and people contracting either cancer or heart disease as a result. The part of their reason for that is that you have so many different risk factors converging to interact with one another. And it is hard, very hard, to isolate all these other risk factors, especially the social determinant of health risk factors. So how are you going to isolate those which may not be related to chemical pollution from chemical factories? How are you going to isolate those from the actual effect of chemical pollution to the population affected? So this is where the debate scientifically from the standpoint of both toxicologists and the risk assessment experts. And then there are also those who do atmospheric science, and they try to use satellite data and correlate satellite data with ground level data, and use that to predict what the health effects would be depending on the level of exposure of people in the community to particular either air toxin, especially air, and especially if it is a carcinogen chemical. And so those ones are also not able to make this causality connection. Then you have some other scientists who have looked, I think Terrell and Julian they published a paper recently in 2022, January, where they made they used what they call linear regression, and then they looked at the EPA National Toxic Assessment, and then used census data from the U.S. Census Bureau, and then they used some more models, different models, and then they concluded that there is a link in terms of air pollutant. There is a link between those who are exposed to especially carcinogen, and because they have high risk of contracting cancer. So they made a correlation between that high risk of contracting cancer when they are excessively exposed to these carcinogenic chemicals And then they link that to the high incidence of cancer in that population. So they made the correlation, they made the connection between increased risk of cancer due to exposure to carcinogenic chemical and higher rate of cancer incidence in that population. So I guess that policymakers tend to be persuaded more by what the hardcore scientists say. By that I mean hardcore scientists like toxicologists who have not been able to make this causality connection. And so, but from my perspective, I think that although the science may not be definitively conclusive, but you don't need to have it conclusive. It doesn't need to be conclusive to protect public health. There is sufficient evidence as it is to make responsive public health policy that would protect people in these vulnerable communities. So the evidence is more than anecdotal. It's completely more than anecdotal evidence. There is data supporting it. It may not be ironclad conclusive, but there is enough there to support a responsive policy to protect the public health of people in vulnerable communities. I mean, there has been also some studies that have looked at the interaction of gene and genetics. And so, traditionally, it has always been that, for example, obesity is somehow genetic. And also that it is a metabolic disease, lifestyle and all of that key into that. But scientists have also done some studies that show that the pollution stressors, when somebody is exposed to it in certain communities, that can play into altering the genetic makeup to some degree, and then meaning it's going to influence the genetic makeup some degree to become a contributory factor to that person becoming obese. So the person can do exercise, eat right, and do all the other things right, but because of the influence, environmental influence on the genetic makeup of that person, it's going to be very difficult to shed the obesity problem. And so these things are interrelated, interlinked, and I think that we do not have to wait for a definitive ironclad evidence of causality to be able to do so. Again, that's what public health is about. It's about, for the most part, you have public health bubble, a lot of things in that bubble, the preventative health side, and then the curative health side, and what have you. But the biggest portion in that bubble is the preventative side of public health. Yeah. And so you don't want to wait until it becomes a catastrophe before you begin to scour around to create policy to deal with it. It is better to deal with it at the front end, not at the back end. And so I think that if public health cannot address this issue, then public health is meaningless. It has to address this issue because I believe even the scientists who seem to think about, or who seem to say that there's no causality connection, they all agree that if you live in a community where you are exposed to increased pollution, and that you will be at increased risk of developing health problems. So increased pollution correlates to increased risk of developing health problems. And that is sufficient for public health from the preventative side of that. And then the other thing for environmental law, the precautionary principle that we talk about in environmental law, that is also something I believe that can play a role in being able or to be utilized as a vehicle to create more responsive policy. It's just a question of whether there is a political will to be able to pull that off. But I think on the science side, we have sufficient evidence from the lens of public health to do something.
So this is, now we're digging into it now. This is at the root of what we're talking about. And Lori, I'm gonna have to come to you on this one. Because, and Dr. Aurier, thank you for joining us. Please join us stay with us as long as you can. You have set the charge, you've set the stage in terms of what is the foundational aspect of this debate. So thank you for setting that up. Now, Lori, a couple of the things that Dr. Aurier mentioned, I know I have some perspective and some thoughts on that as well in terms of the role of science as we think about these things. But we've talked about this in the past in terms of preparing for this today. One of the things Dr. Aurier talked about was how science plays into government decision-making on public policy. And I know that you have some perspective that you'd like to share with this group on. Now, what is the role of government? After hearing the scientific charge and the scientific basis for this, what is in fact the role of government in this conversation?
So that's a little bit of matter of perspective. I agree with Asti in terms of government, the Constitution is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I think one of the things that people don't understand with the environmental movement on the pollution side, because there's the pollution side and there's the natural resource side. On the pollution side, the evolution of environmental law, one is a unique United States contribution to the whole universe of the laws and the things that we address is it evolved in a stovepipe. And so on the scientific aspect of it, if you have a company that has a Clean Air Act permit, a Clean Water Act permit, and a Resource Conservation Recovery Act permit, the hazardous waste permit, each of those permits is issued in a vacuum. And so one of the things to understand is a permit is a license to pollute. It's not a license to say, specifically, how do I protect the environment? All of these statutes have a goal of protecting human health and the environment, but at the end of the day, it's a license to pollute. And they're issued in a vacuum. And so we don't have an environmental system here, and I'm not really aware of some of the other faculty at Tulane, maybe in an international context, where there's multimedia permits. And so in terms of government, we have a role in terms of setting policy, setting standards, making sure that they're enforced. But that policy perspective is really informed by the population. And so if you're only hearing from industry and you don't hear from individuals, the policy is going to go a certain way. And I think we're at a point where everyone is understanding. I was talking to somebody earlier, like NIMBY, not in my backyard. You're just looking at your neighborhood and you can't look at your neighborhood in isolation. It is a global community right now. And so deforestation in the Amazon affects air quality across the globe. It affects weather patterns across the globe. And it's the same thing with pollution. And so thinking it's going to be confined into just one little zip code is not an accurate way to think about it. And so everything is continuing to evolve, but we have a history of these environmental laws. Some of them are more than 50 years old, but they're not an aggregate look at things. And so I think it's important for government and decision makers to, follow the law and issue the permits and things, et cetera. But it really comes down to the public comments that comes in from community. When a permit is issued, you need to think about what you're doing today and what the effects are 30 years down the road. And so it's the public comment period from industry, but also the affected community that's most important in terms of shaping government policy and what happens. And I think a perfect example of how Tulane has been has interacted in this space was Shintech, when the Environmental Law Clinic challenged the permits for Shintech. And that was because they were looking at it in an aggregated space. within Cancer Alley. And so while on the regulatory side, we have to go with what's in front of us, the public comments and the public interaction and asking to look at the science in a different way is really how you shape government policy and what the outcomes are. And I think that's something that everyone really needs to understand about being engaged. And so it's not a matter of, is plant XYZ going to be located in your neighborhood? It's like, how does plant XYZ affect my whole city or community on an aggregate? And I think companies have to think that way too, not just where it's easier to cite a facility because of political pressure, et cetera. We all have to start thinking about things in an aggregate whole. Otherwise, you don't address the public health issues that Dr. Ori talked about.
Aste, what do you think about that in terms of like the role of government and the role of policy in this space?
I totally agree that it should be a cumulative look at the community that you're issuing a permit for to begin with. Like, I'll use my own community just to be clear. Tulane's Law Clinic actually was helping my community during, I think it was 2016, when there was a big flood in Baton Rouge and all of the debris from the flood was being put in the landfill that is actually in Alison, Louisiana. Alison, Louisiana also holds, like I told you guys, a Exxon chemical plant. So when you're issuing a permit and you're thinking about what will if you're industry and you're applying for a permit, what will my actual facility do? Okay, let's say in the perfect world, if you're running as amazingly as Jared is over at Dow, and you're not doing any harm to those community people that live there. They also are getting downwind from this landfill already. There is a smell when you drive past this landfill that is a smell that none of you have probably ever smelled in your life. And I'm not talking trash, I'm talking a chemical smell, because as we know, they emit methane, right? So when we're thinking about how it will harm these places, we're also, you neglect to think about the fact that I have not had the soil tested at my grandmother's house, but she wanted to start a garden. And I was like, girl, we're getting you some boxes, you will not put anything in the ground there. But my great grandfather who purchased that land, like I told you, was a sharecropper. She grew up farming on that land. So, so you're not thinking, like, you have to take the empathy that Lori spoke about earlier of who lives here. Why is it only Black people that live here? Maybe there's a history of why Black people only live in certain places in Louisiana. I ain't gonna go all the way there, but it's just a cumulative impact of who are you harming, how are you harming them, and who else is harming them that we have to think about when we talk about this and the regulation of it. Who's coming to check Exxon chemical plant? So then it becomes the responsibility of the community to, there's a group called the Bucket Brigade where they teach people how to make air monitoring, devices in their own community, because if I don't provide the science, nobody is. So that's how a lot of these communities feel.
Yeah, and I mean, one other thing to provide as a perspective building on both of these, as a regulated entity, the challenge with us is, to Lori's point, we are based off of permits and licenses to operate. So within that license to operate, we have to do modeling, we have to do monitoring. You heard Dr. Ori talk about the dose response curve. We have to do all of that, looking at that linearity of those different models to be able to get this permit. And so what we're having to do in industry is take what you've heard from Lori and Aste and figure out, how do we integrate what Dr. Ori talked about in terms of social determinants of health, these concepts of chemical stressors and non-chemical stressors. I'm trying to talk inside the company about how do I integrate those two, because we get a permit that says you need to do X, Y, and Z to operate. And to get that permit, you need to do and test A, B, and C. Now, but this concept that Aste is talking about in terms of the cumulative impacts, there is enough data to substantiate that there are things that we need to look at. So now, if we can't get if there isn't a causal connection that Dr. Aurier mentioned, then what else do we need to do? So maybe X substance did not cause Y harm. Maybe that stressor did not cause it directly. But what we have to think about as a regulated entity is what additional things should we be thinking about? Is our facility located in a food desert? Are we located in a community where there are health equity challenges, where people are medically underserved? Are we dealing with communities and fence line partners and neighbors that have a certain education level that prevents them from being able to afford to get certain types of things, right? I love the reference of, oh, well, X might have been caused by not exercising. And I think to myself, like, if you're working 3 jobs, like, when do you have time to exercise? Or X person didn't eat healthy. Well, who can afford Whole Foods? And is there even a Whole Foods in my neighborhood, right? So there are these kind of conversations that on the industry side, we are going to have differently than we've had in the past, but they are not in the rubric of a permit. And so that's the challenge on our side, to figure out, how do we take these perspectives and kind of integrate them into a system that wasn't built for that. You were right, Lori, in articulating these 1970s environmental statutes were written in an independent, discrete, insular way. And so now we're trying to 40, 50 years later, figure out how to back integrate it. And so that's something that I think we need to think about. Look, I want to go to a couple things quickly before we hear from you guys. The role of the community. You heard Lori talk about, look, it's not just about the permit, it's about the comments and the community engagement on this. When you think about the role of the community, whether it's anecdotal evidence, whether it's, other types of things that has been passed down from an oral history perspective, what should companies like mine and others be thinking about with regard to community engagement? What should be where does that fit into this regulatory process or this public policy process?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is, Lori mentioned NIMBY. Who does that apply to? Because I can scream and yell and say, not in my backyard. I can stand in front of the truck and they will say, get out of the street. Get your tail out of the street, okay? So that's the first thing where it's like, I think, first of all, oppressed communities already have fought so much. And so to, say that the role of community and public commenting and, showing up is hard, especially when, they're plagued with other things, like you said, like a food desert or, not only having transportation to get to Whole Foods. Even if I want to eat healthy, I might not, I don't live within 3 miles of a Whole Foods. So, some of those things are important, but I think, if we talk about like historical and anecdotal things, I think it's important for us to tell our stories. I think if y'all are gonna leave here and be looking for Allison, Louisiana on, your maps probably, because you may have never heard of it, but it is a historically, it's a community that faces a lot of environmental injustices. And so I think it's important for us to tell those stories, but I think it's also important, like I said, to make sure that we're using that communiversity model. HBCUs as well as PWIs need to be partnering with the communities that they are in. If they know that there is injustice, I think it's important for us to be able to tell those stories and also have our science respected. Lori brought a term to me that, she said it's usually respected in the Native community, but now it's being brought across the board, which was, remind me, Lori?
Traditional
Ecological knowledge. Yeah.
Traditional ecological knowledge. And so that's for people who live in these areas, who have been living in these areas. And like I said, I'm not gonna take y'all on a history lesson of why plants are where former plantations are and why that is where we live. But if that's where we have lived for generations, then I believe that we have this ecological knowledge that should be weighed in when these permits are given and decisions are made. So I think it's important for government and industry to take responsibility to go into the community and speak with the community. And don't give up with, oh, well, we gave notice on the website where you got to dig, all the way down that we were having a public comment. who has time to go digging on the website? You need to, the same way you can mail me my property taxes. You can send a notice in the mail that there is a permit out in your area. And if you would like to make a comment, do it online or come in person. Like, there should be better access to it.
And a part of that definition that Lori opened with is meaningful engagement. And that is what we within the industry are trying to make sure that we are thinking about. What does meaningful look like? Because what it looked like yesterday may not be the way it needs to look today or tomorrow. And I think that that's what we're trying to figure out. Let me just say this. Why are we talking about this now? And like, why are we opening this reunion weekend with this topic? Like, why now? I think what I have seen in terms of two decades of working in this space is we are at a unique inflection point. We're at this point, I would argue, somewhat triggered by George Floyd 2 years ago, and I'll speak from an industry perspective, that it is this realization that you look at criminal justice, you look at health justice with COVID, you look at climate justice in terms of communities that are more vulnerable, you look at environmental justice. These movements, which were somewhat isolated before, we're seeing the confluence and the integration of these more now. So where people are like, isn't it interesting that the same group that couldn't get the vaccine is the same group that's living in a low-lying area, is also the same group that live, right? So you start to see these trends. And so what I think is that the movement has now started to build in a way that it will force all of us to have a different kind of conversation. It's insurmountable. And I think that that's a good thing. This discourse, let me tell you, the conversation we're having within Dow in 2023 is probably a bit different from the one we started when I started as an intern in 1998. And I can imagine that it's the same type of change in conversation and dialogue that we are seeing across not just my company, but other companies as well. So look, you can tell we are not shy about talking about this. We are all very passionate about this from different perspectives, but I would love to hear from some of you. Some of you, many of you are not environmental lawyers. You're not working in this environmental space, but I hope today has helped give you some perspective on the areas that do reflect and cross over with the areas that you support and the areas that you are currently working in. So let me just open it up to see, are there any questions or comments or just perspectives that you'd like to share based on what you've heard from us this morning?
Well, I have one. I'm actually certificated in environmental as well.
Please go to the mic, DeShonda, and introduce yourself.
All right, DeShonda Charles, class of 2003. So I'm certificated in environmental law as well, but I don't work in this space, but I understand it. But my question is, what is the incentive for these companies to actually get it right? Like, you have the conversation, I believe you're quite passionate about it and actually are trying to move the needle. But if it's a fine, if they get the permit, they do what they want to do. And if the penalty is a fine, what is the actual motivation or incentive for the companies to get it right? To move a plant, correct the pollution. So that's what I see as part of the larger issue with correcting the injustices in the community. So I'd like to hear your perspective on that.
Yes, I'll start and let you guys weigh in. So a couple things, right? Part of it, you want to just do the right thing. That's an incentive to just want to do the right thing. You don't want to pay the fine, so you want to try to do the right thing to not pay that fine. That's a secondary piece. But DeShonda, the other piece that is also unique now, that's different today than it was yesterday, if I could be direct, brand equity and brand erosion. It's not about paying a $20,000 fine. It's about what happens when we pay that fine and get blasted on the Wall Street Journal and our stock drops. Because what is happening now, we have this concept called ESG, environmental social governance, where now Wall Street is saying, look, I have looked at your earnings report. I've looked at your sustainability report, but I'm sitting at my desk in Manhattan and I need to give you a score for what you are quantifiably doing to address environmental and social issues. And I'm going to score your company on it. And guess what? Other investors are going to make decisions based on where you are on that score. And by the way, Every time you have a hiccup or a burp in your plant and you get an enforcement, it's going to count against your score. So we are in a position now to where it's not only about doing the right thing. It's not only about providing financial stability to our shareholders by not having to pay fines. It is also about brand equity and avoiding brand erosion and reputation by being perceived as a company that doesn't get this right. We have a number of different drivers, I think, to try to get this right.
So I will speak from an enforcement perspective.
Your mic's not on.
Is it now?
Yeah.
Okay. So like I said, I see individuals and companies at their worst. I've only recently started working with them in a more positive light. So my comments are from an enforcement perspective. And what I'm going to say is, in terms of enforcement, if you're looking for enforcement to solve the issue, it's too late. And the way to view enforcement, there's a quote that I like to recite from Chester Bowles, who was in the FDR administration. There's 20% of corporations or individuals that will do the right thing regardless. They will just follow the rules because there's rule followers. There's 5% who will break the rules every time because they have blatant disregard. The other 75%, their behavior is modulated by what you do to the 5%. And that's the way to think about enforcement, because there's not enough inspectors, there's not enough civil enforcement lawyers, there's not enough prosecutors to get 100% compliance, because we're not going to have eyes everywhere. And so that's why when I focused on role of government, I focused on the beginning of the spectrum. It's like where you make your siting decisions for facilities, permits, et cetera, is extremely important, because if I'm working in a community that has 10 plants that have a Clean Air Act permit to release benzene, and there's a high incidence level of leukemia, which can be linked to benzene, 8 of the facilities are in compliance with their permits. There's 1 that has committed civil violations, and they get a fine. They're told to, have to get on a compliance plan to come in compliance. And I have 1 facility that operated criminally, where maybe I put the plant manager in jail or what have you. Those 2 facilities, I brought them into compliance, but the other 8 were legally emitting benzene, and you're having an aggregate effect. And so that's why it's so important to think about things at the beginning, at the state and local government level, because the federal oversight, we don't have oversight over zoning decisions or where you decide to put a facility. And it's so important to think about that at the beginning. And Jared is right. Companies care about their public profile. I've seen worked on cases where you prosecuted 1 company and they were made an example of, and everyone else said, I don't want to be that company. But the thing to understand about environmental law, including natural resource law, this is mostly a self-monitoring, self-reporting system in the pollution scheme. Like I said, we don't have enough inspectors, state or federal, to cover it all. And then with natural resource crimes, is crimes of opportunity. Low risk, high reward. No one's going to see you cutting that tree in the middle of the Amazon, or that you've trafficked people into the Amazon to do the harvesting or what have you. Probably not going to be seen, but all of us are affected by it. I mean, I've learned new terms like narco trafficking. They're all getting into these legal spaces because there's lower risk. And it's very important for everyone to be aware of these issues and engage in whatever way you feel like you can engage. And that's including going to the public meetings. As Asti said, how are you making me aware with our victim outreach programs for these issues? There's, a lot of historical bias against the government, a lot of distrust. No one wants to hear, I'm from the government, I'm here to help you. Nobody wants to hear that. There's a lot of distrust, but that community engagement, like the bucket brigades and so forth, bringing information for enforcement cases, or other companies being willing to report on their competitors or so forth, which everybody doesn't like to do, but doing it in a safe, confidential space, because we basically, like I said, there's that 5%, but I don't think everyone goes out to say, well, I want to go into a community and pollute and raise cancer rates. I just don't think that that's like the mindset. But understanding how their activities impact everyone and getting that community engagement, and it's really imperative on communities, but you're just going to have to take the reins. Because they said the government is responsive to the information we have and what we hear. And we need to hear it. And if we don't hear it, if there's a permitting decision and there's a public meeting and everyone is in favor of the plant and no one comes up and says, I have this issue that needs to be addressed, it's not going to be addressed. And so it's really important to understand the space you're living in and the overall impact. Otherwise, it's not going to be addressed. And I'll give one other example and then I'll shut up. Why you're hearing about it more now is this is my 4th administration, and I've seen how policy has ebbed and flowed. And there's certain environmental issues, once it affects everybody, then everybody gets involved. And I would say, going back to the perfect example is fracking for natural gas. Until you heard that people's taps were being set on fire when they were turning on the taps, including multi-million-dollar homes, everybody was concerned about it. And so there's certain things that once it affects everybody, everybody's engaged. And I think we're kind of in that space now, understanding the interconnectedness for not just pollution crimes, but natural resource crimes, how it impacts transnational or criminal organizations, et cetera, the whole impact of it. And then the people who are being most affected, I think with social media has helped, where they have more of a voice. And they can get their message out there and they're not being drowned out by, well, do I have access to a PR firm or et cetera to get my message out there? And it's really important to hear from everyone and to be engaged.
Lastly, your closing comments on kind of where we leave this and where we go. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Hi, Gita Bowl, class of 93. I'm in Houston where, on the news, we see regularly where the train yard is tied to the cancer clusters for the Fifth Ward area. And so I don't work in this space, but I wanted to know if you guys had recommendations of how best do I use my voice to impact or assist those individuals.
So I think the first thing that everybody can do is be informed, follow people you trust on this issue, follow organizations in Houston. They will tell you where they need help and you can lend your time. If you are a barred attorney, sometimes they just need somebody to look over something for them. Sometimes they just need help writing something so that they can get the attention that it deserves. And I mean, you can help we've seen social media, like Lori mentioned, we've seen social media campaigns make big change. So if you follow those there are environmental justice organizations in Houston, environmental justice organizations all across Houston, actually, and a lot of them are partnered with Dr. Robert Bullard, who's known as the father of environmental justice at TSU. And there's always something where they're, raising hell about some sort of issue. And you can be a part of that as well, showing up when you need to, helping them to draft their public comments. There's always a need for us in every social justice space. I think cancel culture is huge too. I wanted to say, Jared said it eloquently, but cancel culture is the incentive at this point. It's one of our greatest assets right now.
And any other closing thoughts that you would have before we wrap?
My closing remarks are, when you think of environmental justice, to think of it as today's civil rights movement. I think it is solely tied to people of color. And the reason you're hearing about it right now is because, like Laura said, everybody is being affected. Your community is becoming vulnerable now to all of these issues. Houston is flooding, Baton Rouge is flooding, New Orleans is flooding, it's no longer an outskirts issue. And not only is it something that is affecting that community, you don't live in a bubble. They don't live in a bubble. So the pollution does not stay in one place. It is not those poor, unfortunate souls who have to deal with it. All of us do. And it is the root of the climate crisis as well. So I think just stay informed and, try your best to learn and grow in the place that you're in.
Well, thank you so much. And I want to thank you guys for hanging in here with us. One thing I want to do that we'll talk about what we are doing and what we can do here at the university is on this next video here. Oh, and by the way, we meant to have this slide up, but just a quick visual on this difference between equality, equity, and justice. We won't go through this now in the interest of time, but just take 30 seconds and look at this picture, because it's a picture that helps to distinguish these words that are oftentimes used interchangeably, but they are distinct and different, and we need to act in accordance with that. And I think that that's across the board among all different stakeholders. And so I just think as we think about navigating this space, it's something that we should consider. Yep.
So there was one thing I neglected to mention that I think is important that everyone understand. Environmental justice is not a statutory requirement. It's not a regulatory requirement. It's a policy. And policies change based on how people change. And so it's very important, regardless of how you frame the discussion within environmental justice or permitting or what have you, based on who your audience is, you can get the same points across. And it's important to push these issues, but understand that this is not a government requirement. It is policy, and it can change at any minute.
Yeah, I think that's very important.
Thank you, Jared and Adam, for joining me today. Could you introduce yourselves, please?
Hi, Saya. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm Jared Davis. I am the Global Public Policy Director for Dow around social equity and human rights, and I'm the class of 2005 at Tulane.
And I'm Adam Shemp, and I'm a senior attorney at the Environmental Law Institute.
Jared, can you tell us why you dreamt up this externship opportunity?
Sure, Saya. I mean, really, there were three main objectives that I had in pulling together this program and funding it at Tulane with the Environmental Law Institute. First, I really wanted to focus on building a diverse pipeline of environmental lawyers. I think that there is a unique opportunity to really build out the voices that will be a part of this emerging discourse in this area. And the second thing I really wanted to do was to advance the topic of environmental justice. As a Southerner, as a person who majored in environmental science, growing up in a community where I know that these issues are very important, I really wanted to advance that topic, and I couldn't think of a better place to do it than ELI. And the third piece of ELI and what I really wanted to promote is the concept around public policy in legal education. Environmental justice is one of those topics that will require and will take the advancement, the ingenuity, the creativity of public policy to really drive and effectuate change.
Adam, could you tell us about ELI and what's involved with the clerkship?
Certainly, and going off of Jared's point, ELI is a research and education institution. We are nonpartisan, but as one of our former presidents, I think very aptly put it, we are pro-environment in a very broad sense of the term. We don't litigate or lobby, but that does give us an opportunity to do some things that are pretty unique in this space. We're effectively sort of a mix between a think tank and a consulting group for government agencies, and we are able to work behind the scenes with a lot of governments. About half of our work is international, About half of it is domestic. We cover almost everything in environmental law and policy. And we try to pass, with regard to the clerkship, we try to pass that along to the clerks as well. For each one of our clerkships, we tailor the experience of that clerk to their interests. That goes to the subject matter that they're working on, the types of projects that we're doing. Again, since we do almost everything, it's very easy to be able to get the clerks the type of substantive exposure that they're looking for. We also focus very much on skill building, and going back to Jared's point, research, writing, analysis, communication skills, all of those things within this environmental law and policy space, trying to make sure that the clerks, we talk to them before they arrive about what they're trying to get out of the experience, and then try to tailor those projects to their particular interest and what they're hoping to gain substantively and from a skill standpoint. The other thing that we really try to focus on during the course of that clerkship is the networking element, getting a better understanding of what the field looks like, what types of opportunities are out there. And one of the unique elements of this particular clerkship is one-on-one conversations with practitioners focused on those particular substantive areas and sectors of interest to the clerk, be that in law firms, in industry, in nonprofits or government, being able to get people some more connections and then just exposure and understanding of what it takes to sort of build a career in this space.
An excellent opportunity. Just a little bit about the nuts and bolts from Tulane side. This is a 10-week program for which you're awarded 3 experiential credits for the externship portion. You have the option of completing the externship, which is 4 weeks long, either remotely or on site in Washington, D.C. at ELI. There's a roughly $5,000 salary for the internship portion of the program, and that's 6 weeks in Washington, D.C. with ELI. There's also a $3,000 housing stipend to use as you see fit, either during the externship portion remotely or for the entire 10 weeks in DC if you choose. The application deadline is February 10th. For more information, take a look at Chris, or you can come see me in Suite 232, or you can reach out via email. My email address is smith19@tulane.edu. We hope you'll apply. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for having us, and Dean Jupiter, we will turn it over to you to close us out.
Right, thank you. I want to give another round of applause for this incredible Ms. Asti, we sure appreciate you being here, and I hope our students will be able to take advantage of your unique experiences and expertise in these topics and grow and learn with you all too. So housekeeping, you now have a break until 1 p.m. So please come back. 1 p.m. is our sports law panel. And though it doesn't appear in your program, that's just an error. We had a lot to do, but it really is taking place 1 o'clock here in this room. But first, please go check out some of the incredible Black-owned vendors who are participating in our market day right outside in Monroe Quad. And I think Michelle's coming down with another special presentation. So yeah, feel free to walk around the school. If you're doing a tour, you're going to be meeting your tour guides, our BALSA students, I believe, in the lobby. If you're going to engage in some shopping, happy shopping. We gave you bags to help facilitate all of your purchases, including on behalf of BALSA. They are selling alumni t-shirts and sweatshirts. And that's my last shameless plug today. Go ahead.
Hi. I don't want to keep everybody. I want to echo everything that she said about Market Friday. Most of our vendors are set up. They are ready to dazzle you with all of the items that they have for sale. So make sure that you go out there and support that. And I just want to make a final special presentation to our moderator and our panelists for coming today. We really do appreciate each and every one of you for all of the time and the energy and the commitment that you all have put into making this such a successful weekend. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
I know it's not, right? But yes, I'll be watching the recording with the same gusto that you all made these presentations. So thank y'all.
Great, thank you. Just one other quick thing. Dean Jupiter, before you go, I gotta do you like I did Michelle, I want to thank just a couple people on this externship program that you just saw the video for. First of all, I want to thank Dean Meyer and Trev. We've been talking a long time about trying to make this happen, and so I'm very appreciative of that. I want to thank Judge Roby. Judge Roby was behind the scenes and helping me really think about how to actually get this up and going. And it was over a year ago, Judge Roby, that we started to talk about that. So I want to thank you for that. And finally, I want to say it was Tanya Jupiter and Saya Smith who helped me to get this across the finish line for our BOLSA students to be able to participate in this thing and making this dream a reality here at Tulane. So thank you very much for doing that.